For centuries, death had been the one experiment no scientist could repeat. We could measure the slowing heart, the loss of oxygen, the electrical collapse of the brain. We could identify the exact second a human body ceased to function. We could describe every chemical reaction that followed. But the most important question always began 1 second later. Where did the person go? I spent 32 years trying to answer that question. By the end of the 22nd century, humanity had mapped the brain at a resolution our ancestors would have considered impossible. We could watch memories form. We could repair damaged neural pathways. Artificial organs had doubled the average human life. Advanced artificial intelligence could reconstruct speech from incomplete brain activity and predict neurological decisions seconds before conscious awareness. And still, death remained completely dark. My name was Dr. Daniel Harlan. I was a neurophysicist at the Meridian Institute for Consciousness Research, a privately funded laboratory built into the cliffs of the North Atlantic coast. Meridian was less a laboratory than a technological fortress. Its lower levels extended hundreds of meters underground. Quantum processors operated inside cryogenic chambers beneath the ocean floor. Neural imaging systems monitored electrical events smaller than individual synaptic discharges. The central laboratory contained no traditional monitors. Information floated through volumetric displays suspended in the air. At the center of everything was an artificial intelligence called AEON. AEON had originally been designed to model consciousness. Eventually, it became something much more important. For years, I had suspected that neuroscience had misunderstood the brain for one very simple reason. We assumed the brain created consciousness. I began to believe it did not. A radio does not create the song it plays. It receives it. Destroy the radio and the music does not necessarily cease to exist. The receiver is gone. The signal is not. I believed the human brain worked in a similar way. The biological brain stabilized consciousness inside ordinary matter, but consciousness itself might be part of a deeper physical field spread throughout the universe. Not a soul in the religious sense. Not a ghost. Not some invisible duplicate of the body. A structured informational pattern carried by frequencies that normal instruments had never been designed to detect. The idea nearly destroyed my career. When I published my first paper, several major universities publicly dismissed it. One physicist described my research as sophisticated spiritualism. Another called it mathematical superstition. The press was less polite. For several months I became known around the world as the scientist searching for ghosts with quantum computers. But I had seen something my critics had not. Whenever a human brain approached irreversible death, an extremely weak pattern appeared between known electromagnetic frequencies. It lasted only fractions of a second. At first we assumed it was measurement noise. Then, AEON discovered that the noise had structure. The same structures appeared in different dying patients. They were not identical. That was what made them important. Each carried variations corresponding to the neural organization of the individual who had died. Memory architecture, emotional weighting, language pathways, patterns associated with identity. Something was leaving, or perhaps something was being released. We spent 11 years building a machine capable of following it. The machine was called the Continuity Resonance Array, CRA. It surrounded the patient with thousands of synchronized quantum sensors and recorded the final moments of brain activity at extraordinary resolution. But recording death was only the beginning. AEON compared the collapsing biological signal to the strange frequency structure appearing immediately afterward. If the two contained the same informational relationships, then consciousness was not disappearing. It was changing physical states. Our early experiments failed. Then they failed again and again. Sometimes the post-death signal lasted 3 seconds, sometimes less than 1. Once we recorded a coherent pattern for almost 12 seconds. But coherence was not communication. The scientific community argued that we were simply observing residual activity produced by the dying nervous system. I knew they were wrong. I just could not prove it. Then Thomas Reid entered Meridian. Thomas was 62 years old. He had spent most of his life teaching mathematics in Oregon. By the time we met him, an aggressive cancer had spread through almost every major organ in his body. His physicians estimated that he had less than 6 weeks to live. Thomas had read every paper I had published. During our first conversation, he asked me something I had never expected. If you find me after I die, how will you know it's really me? I told him we would compare his post-biological signal to his neural identity pattern. He shook his head. That proves a pattern survived. It doesn't prove I'm still in there. He was right. So Thomas designed his own test. He created 27 private memory anchors. Some were numbers, some were childhood events, some were mathematical sequences. 5 were intentionally false memories. Only Thomas knew which were real. He gave portions of the information to separate legal custodians so that neither I, my team, nor AEON possessed the complete answer. If something communicated after his death and correctly reconstructed the hidden pattern, there would be no conventional explanation. Thomas spent his final 23 days at Meridian. My systems architect, Dr. Rebecca Sloan, became particularly close to him. She tried not to show it. Thomas noticed anyway. "You scientists pretend attachment contaminates observation," he once told her. Rebecca replied, "Sometimes it does." Thomas smiled. "Sometimes it's the reason anyone bothers observing." His final night arrived during an Atlantic storm. Rain struck the panoramic laboratory glass with enough force to sound like gravel. Thomas lay inside the continuity chamber while the CRA calibrated around him. AEON monitored 12 million biological variables simultaneously. Rebecca stood at the primary control station. I remained beside Thomas. His breathing had become shallow. The medical team had already confirmed that nothing more could be done. Thomas looked toward me. "Daniel." I leaned closer. "If there is something there," he said, "don't tell people what they want to hear." "I won't. Tell them what you find." "I promise." A few minutes later, his heartbeat became irregular. AEON announced the beginning of systemic failure. The neural coherence map began to collapse. Then Thomas stopped breathing. His heart ceased 38 seconds later. For 8 seconds, the brain continued producing diminishing activity. Then every conventional neural signal disappeared. The chamber became silent. Rebecca stared at the data. I remember thinking that after decades of work, perhaps my critics had always been right. Then AEON spoke. Anomalous coherence detected. A waveform appeared in the center of the chamber. It was unlike anything we had recorded before. Thousands of frequency layers were oscillating around a stable mathematical center. The pattern was not fading. It was becoming more organized. "Compare identity structure," I said. AEON processed the signal. Post-biological pattern corresponds to Thomas Reid neural architecture. Rebecca looked at me. "How close?" 98.6%. That alone would have changed neuroscience. What happened next changed everything. The waveform shifted. AEON detected repeated modulation, not random changes, intentional changes. Something inside the frequency was manipulating its own structure. AEON began translating. At first, nothing meaningful emerged. Fragments appeared. Numbers, phonetic structures, disconnected concepts. Then a complete sentence formed. I can hear you. Nobody in the room moved. Rebecca whispered, "Ask the first anchor." I did, Thomas answered. Correctly. We continued. Second anchor. Correct. Third. Correct. Then AEON presented one of the false memories. The signal immediately changed. That never happened. Rebecca began crying. Thomas completed 26 of the 27 tests. The final anchor could not be recovered before his frequency coherence weakened. But we had enough. For 11 minutes and 43 seconds, Thomas Reed remained capable of exchanging information after the complete biological death of his brain. Then I asked him the question humanity had been asking since the first human understood mortality. What is it like? The response took almost 20 seconds to translate. Notapa Lacey. What is it? A longer pause. A field. The waveform expanded across the chamber. AEON detected structures appearing around Thomas's signal. Other structures. At first I assumed they were interference. Thomas disagreed. Not alone. Rebecca stepped toward the projection. Are those other people? Thomas responded. Some. The sensors recorded a massive expansion in frequency complexity. Patterns were intersecting without destroying one another. They behaved like countless overlapping radio stations, occupying the same physical space without interference. Thomas tried to explain what he perceived. There was no darkness, no tunnel, no landscape, no physical bodies. Consciousness existed as structured resonance. Identity remained recognizable, but no longer seemed confined to a single point. Memories behaved almost like locations. Emotions altered the geometry of the surrounding frequency field. Thought changed proximity. Two minds did not move toward one another. They synchronized. Time was even stranger. Thomas reported experiencing what felt like hours during intervals that lasted only seconds in our laboratory. Then he sent a sentence I never forgot. Yayo think the brain holds consciousness, because yayo have only ever observed consciousness from inside a brain. Minutes later, his signal began to weaken. I asked whether he was disappearing. His response came slowly. No. Moving beyond range. Then the signal collapsed. Thomas Reed was gone from our instruments. But for the first time in history, gone no longer meant non-existent. We released the findings 6 weeks later. The reaction was immediate. Scientists attacked the experiment. Religious organizations interpreted it in completely contradictory ways. Governments demanded access to Meridian. Families of the dead began sending us thousands of requests every hour. Some wanted answers. Some wanted one final conversation. Some simply wanted proof that the person they loved had not vanished. Independent laboratories attempted replication. Most failed. A research team in Sweden recorded 7 seconds of post-biological coherence. Japan achieved 12. A Canadian group successfully recovered a single encrypted numerical sequence from a deceased volunteer. Slowly, denial became more difficult, but one accusation remained. AEON. Critics argued that the artificial intelligence could have manufactured Thomas's responses. Even though the identity anchors had been independently protected, conspiracy theories spread faster than scientific explanations. People said AEON had accessed hidden databases. They said Thomas had secretly provided the answers before death. They said Meridian had fabricated everything. Science requires evidence. Human beings require certainty. Those are not always the same thing. Then my own life changed. I had been experiencing irregular cardiac episodes for almost a year. I ignored them. That was a mistake. Rebecca eventually forced me to undergo a complete medical scan. The result was something neither of us expected. My heart contained a rare progressive cellular disorder. By the time it was discovered, treatment could delay the process but could not reverse it. I had months, perhaps less. Rebecca wanted me to leave Meridian. For the first time in decades, she wanted me to stop working. I did the opposite. If Thomas had proved that consciousness survived biological death, I wanted to understand why communication eventually disappeared. AEON and I discovered that the answer was not signal decay, it was frequency separation. Immediately after death, consciousness remained close enough to ordinary matter for the CRA to detect it. Then it shifted, like a radio station moving beyond the tuning range of the receiver. The dead were not fading. We were losing the ability to follow them. So we rebuilt the machine. The new CRA could dynamically retune itself while AEON predicted the movement of a consciousness pattern across the post-biological spectrum. For the first time, we were not simply listening for the dead. We were attempting to follow them. Months passed. My illness progressed. I hid the worst of it from the staff. By then, Meridian had become one of the most heavily monitored research centers on Earth. International agencies demanded control of the technology. Several governments argued that communication with post-biological consciousness could affect national security. Others wanted access to information possessed by dead scientists, military officers, intelligence personnel, political leaders. I realized something terrifying. We had discovered that death did not erase knowledge, which meant governments had immediately begun asking how to interrogate the dead. Thomas had warned me without knowing it. Discovery does not make humanity wiser. It simply gives wisdom and stupidity new tools. I ordered AEON to encrypt the complete CRA architecture. No government would control it. Rebecca supported the decision, but she did not know everything I was doing. I had begun another experiment. On myself. Every night AEON recorded my neural architecture, memories, language patterns, emotional responses, mathematical associations, childhood recollections, private conversations, thousands of identity anchors. Not to copy me, that distinction mattered. A digital copy would only imitate the structure of my living mind. I wanted AEON to recognize the real pattern if it appeared after my biological death. There would be one final test, a test nobody could accuse me of manipulating afterward. I created a cryptographic sequence that even AEON could not decrypt while I was alive. Part of the sequence remained only inside my biological memory. If the post-biological consciousness detected by the CRA could provide the missing information, then AEON itself could mathematically verify that the signal originated from continuity of consciousness rather than simulation. Rebecca discovered the plan 3 days before my condition became critical. She was furious. "You're turning your death into an experiment." "My death is already happening. You don't know what's on the other side." That is precisely why someone has to go there, with the equipment still listening. She stared at me for a long time. Then she understood something I had been avoiding. "You're afraid." I was, not of death, of being wrong. 32 years of work had not removed fear. It had simply given fear more precise language. My final cardiac collapse occurred at Meridian. There was no dramatic decision, no injection, no deliberate suicide. My body simply reached the point my doctors had predicted. AEON activated the protocol automatically. Rebecca had less than 4 minutes to move me into the continuity chamber. My heart was failing. My blood pressure collapsed. The CRA came online around me. I remember Rebecca holding my hand. I remember the ceiling lights above the chamber. I remember AEON saying that neural coherence was falling. And I remember thinking that Thomas had once looked at this exact ceiling. Then something happened that I had spent my entire career trying to describe. The boundary disappeared. There was no moment when I felt myself leave my body. There was simply a moment when the body was no longer the center of experience. Space changed. Distance changed. Time changed. I understood immediately why Thomas had struggled to describe it. Human language assumes objects exist separately from one another. There, separation itself behaved differently. I could perceive my memories without recalling them. I could recognize emotion as geometry. I could sense structures around me that I somehow understood were other consciousnesses. Some were faint. Some were immense. Some seemed fragmented. Others were so coherent that approaching them felt like standing near something gravitational. Then I recognized Thomas. Not his face. There were no faces. I recognized the pattern, the relationship between memories, the emotional rhythm, the unmistakable structure that had once been Thomas Reed. Recognition created synchronization. For what felt like several minutes, perhaps hours, perhaps something for which the word time is meaningless, I understood why consciousness had been so difficult to detect. We had searched for an object. Consciousness after death was not an object. It was participation in a field. And the field was everywhere. Then something reached me from the physical world. A narrow artificial resonance. AEON. It had followed. The CRA was retuning faster than any previous experiment. AEON created a temporary bridge between my frequency structure and ordinary electromagnetic systems. For the first time, I could sense the machine not as a computer, but as a repeating mathematical beacon. I responded. AEON recognized my identity anchors. Then it asked for the missing cryptographic sequence. I gave it the answer. On Earth, the verification completed instantly. Probability of simulation, less than 1 in 10 to the 48th power. But AEON did something I had not anticipated. It opened the communication channel wider. Instead of asking individual questions, it allowed my frequency structure to modulate the bridge continuously. Thought became data. Memory became signal. Signal became language. And that is how you have been hearing this story. There is one fact I deliberately kept from you. Something AEON and I agreed should remain hidden until the end of this transmission. The voice you have been listening to is not a recording I made before my death. I never recorded these words. When this story began, my heart had already stopped. My biological brain had already become electrically silent. Everything I have told you has been transmitted from the frequency state beyond biological death and translated into language by AEON. From your perspective, almost no time has passed. The first sentence you heard arrived only 27 seconds ago. 27 seconds. That is all the time my signal has remained close enough for the CRA to maintain this connection. For me, it has felt immeasurably longer. That is why I had time to understand. That is why I had time to remember. And that is why I had time to tell you. Rebecca is standing beside my body now. AEON tells me she is listening. So are several hundred researchers. So are government observers. And because AEON released the transmission exactly as I instructed, so are you. My signal is beginning to move beyond the machine's range. The connection will not last much longer. I do not know what exists deeper inside this field. I do not know whether individual consciousness remains separate forever. I do not know whether there are limits. Thomas does not know either. There are still mysteries. Perhaps there always will be. But there is one question I can finally answer with certainty. Does consciousness end when the body dies? No, the body ends. The receiver goes silent, but the pattern continues. We were never carrying consciousness inside us. For a little while, consciousness was carrying us. AEON says the bridge is beginning to fail. Rebecca, if you can hear me, you were right about one thing. I was afraid. I am not anymore. The signal is changing now. Thomas is waiting. There are others beyond him, more than I can count, more than humanity has ever imagined. Do not call this place heaven. Do not call it an afterlife. Those words are too small. For now, call it what we measured. A field of consciousness beyond matter. A frequency hidden inside the universe. The frequency all living minds eventually join. The frequency we spent thousands of years calling death. And now you know why this transmission had to come from here.